Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And to those who are joining us online, good morning, if it is morning, good evening. And for those who are watching while it's night, I don't want to say good night because I don't want to chase you to bed, but happy night, if I can say that. My name is Jason Braganza. I'm the Executive Director with the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, a Pan-African civil society organization headquartered in Zimbabwe, but I work out of Nairobi, Kenya. It's my esteemed pleasure to bring you and host you during this session on a Friday afternoon during the spring meetings here in Washington, on a session that is gathering a lot of interest and attention as the negotiations towards the IDA21 replenishment take place, and lots of intense conversations around how to make sure the numbers go up, but also to ensure that the replenishment themselves target socioeconomic transformation in the most vulnerable countries in a way that is affordable, very cheap, and not disruptive of social investments across the developing world. So I do have with us a very distinguished panel from different sectors of the divide, and who will be taking us through the next hour or so in this conversation. But before I do that, I'd like to just encourage those who prefer the natural light of the windows just to come a little bit forward, maybe one or two rows, maybe not just the first row, because I know it is Friday, as I said. But just to make the room look a bit more fuller, for those who are watching online, they'll imagine that they're missing out on something very amazing. So please come forward. So thank you once again for making time to be with us to have this very important conversation. With me here in the front is Ms. Jane Nalunga, who is the Executive Director with SEATINI Uganda, Dr. Ed Brown, who is the Senior Director for Research and Programs and Policy at the African Center for Economic Transformation. We have Enrique Blanco Armas, who is the Manager at the World Bank IDA. We have Mr. Andrew Dabalen, who is the Chief Economist for the Africa region at the World Bank. Enrique and Andrew, you'll excuse me if there's a prefix to your name, doctor or anything else, if I've not used them, professor, what have you. I've not received the full bios there, so my apologies if I've missed them out. Dr. Professor. BSc, MSc, MA, everything else, wonderful. I'm glad there's a bit of humor in the room on this Friday afternoon, because the topic and the discussion we're having today requires a bit of that, but also a level of seriousness, given the nature in which we find ourselves during this particular IDA21 replenishment. I think for those of you who've been following the replenishments over the years, I don't think there's been one quite like this, given the depth of the crises that we're facing: economic, climatic, political, social, and so it puts an ever more emphasis of importance on how we need to get a very positive outcome from this replenishment, one that does not indetten countries that are already facing extremely high levels of debt, one that does not continue to promote or perpetuate only or exclusively market-based solutions to some of the struggles or challenges that developing countries are facing. And so I think it is extremely important, as the World Bank president has put it, this is to be the largest ever, or ought to be, the largest ever amidst a poly-crisis. And as the UN Secretary General has also put it, we are facing a development crisis as well. And so it is important for us to consider that in our conversation here today, and to figure out how and what would be the best way to ensure this replenishment meets the expectations of those countries and people that need it the most. And so without much ado, I'd like to open the floor with the first speaker, Ms. Jane Nalunga, to set us up in terms of what it is we're hoping to achieve from this replenishment. Jane, as all eyes are on whether or not IDA21 will be historic, in your perspective, is it necessary to equally focus the question on money, on more money for what? And what would it take for this IDA replenishment round to not just be historical in size, but also in delivering for socio-economic transformation that's needed in the countries that need it the most?
Thank you so much, Jason. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here to have this conversation. You know, IDA has been projected as historic, that it's going to do wonders to our economies, and we are hoping that it might do that. And beyond size, I know size matters. It does. We need more money. That's a fact. So we are not wishing away the issue of the size of the IDA. And in fact, even what is on table, we want more resources, especially as Jason has pointed out, the context is not really good for developing countries, the deepening poly crisis, climate crisis, food crisis, the economic crisis, the debt crisis. So developing countries are in a very, very vulnerable position. And this kind of crisis, I think we have never had it before. So we need really all the resources we can get. We need the resources which are concessional, low interest rate, longer term payment periods. We need grants, really grants even more than even the concessional loans. And this will give us a breathing space. It will give our countries a breathing space to be able to address the multiple challenges, but also be able to think about the future, about structural transformation of the economies. Because today, most countries are living from paying, hand to mouth. You get the money, you pay, you service the loans, then you get another loan, you service another loan. In my country, almost we spend almost 30%, more than almost 30% of the resources, domestic resources we mobilize to servicing loans. So in such a kind of situation, IDA could be it could be a godsend. But how do we make it work for socio-economic development? Why is it important that IDA works for social and economic development? Because unless we address our structural transformation, then we can't exit the vicious cycle of debt. It can never happen, So we need to be able to make sure that our economies are growing, we are increasing production and productivity, we are industrializing, we are creating decent jobs, not just jobs, creating decent jobs, and that we are trading in value-added commodities. Today, what's happening, we are trading in commodities, coffee, cocoa, tea, minerals, raw minerals, copper. You see a country like Zambia trading in copper, but they are on the list of the defaulting, and that's where we are. So IDA has to address that. So that means that we need to reassess the priorities of IDA. Where is the money going? I looked at some of the priority areas, and there is also economic transformation. And I wondered, what are they going to do, to bring out economic transformation? So that means we need to put our issues on the table, that these are the priority sectors. And for me, I believe the priority sectors have to be the productive sectors. A productive, even human capital development is a productive sector, because the people are, the people have to invest in the people, in education, health, water. That's very important. And then next, IDA has to have the priority of investing in the economy, in the real economy, in production and productivity, in agriculture, in minerals, so that we can be able to add value. And that means that IDA should also come up with clear programs, clear targets and indicators for those priorities. For example, indicators around production and productivity, around industries, around value-added products which are being traded. So the indicators have to be clear. Maybe I stop there for the time being. Maybe I can add on.
Thank you very much. And allow me just to recognize Ms. Fati Nzi Hassan, who is the Director for Oxfam in Africa. You're very welcome. Allow me to move to Ed Brown from Assets, just to sort of get the perspective from Asset, particularly the work that you've recently done on the African Transformation Index, and how that intersects with the expectations around the negotiations that are taking place now in IDA21, and how do you think some of that work, together with the calls for a reforming of the global financial architecture that's fit for purpose for the continent, might actually help contribute to enhancing the negotiations around IDA21?
Thank you, Jason, and good afternoon, everyone. I just want to recognize the participants, particularly the co-conveners of this, yourself, Afrodad, Eurodad, Oxfam, and others who have been very active in putting this together. I just wanted to start by making a point. Of the 81 IDA countries since 1960, when IDA was established, 17 have graduated out of it. Over how many years now? Mm. And out of that, I'm not too sure there's any country in Africa that has graduated from IDA. Mm. South Africa was never part of IDA, so we didn't include South Africa. So the verdict on IDA is that it hasn't really performed in a way to get this, because the objective was to work yourself out of the business of financing this and crowding private capital. But it doesn't seem to have worked. And over the last 20 years, we've done some analysis coming up with what we call the African Transformation Index, where we make the point that growth is not enough. And you may recall that in the early 2000s, there was a lot of talk about Africa rising in Financial Times and all over the place. But of course, there is growth, but this growth has not translated into job creation or even resilience. And what we observe is that 5 key variables, or 4 of them, which we think are critical to economic transformation. The first is that growth is important, but you need to diversify your economy. And I'll come to that in a minute. Secondly, you need to be export competitive in order to be able to hedge against external shocks. You also need to increase your productivity. This is the mother of all development. You need to increase productivity. It hasn't happened much in Africa. And of course, using technology, which has been the driver of all the industrial revolutions, is still very, very slow in Africa. And all this combined gives us a picture of human well-being, which is not at par with even the other countries, the peers. Although human well-being has been able to sustain a steady growth, it has not been rising as much as one would expect. Now, diversification, if you take the African countries, about 30 of them that we studied with good data, and what we observed was that diversification of the economy has been declining over time. And by that, I mean, if you take the countries, about 70% of all the products that are exported are primary products, 5 products. 70% of all the exports consist of primary products, 5 main exports in 2000. And in 2020, it's gone up to 90%. It shows that there's so much concentration, there's no diversification. Now the question is, how do you become resilient to hedge against external shocks? So that is very, very, very important. The other issue is that productivity has been declining over time. If you compare to the Asian economies, who at the time, about 30, 40 years ago, were more or less at the same level of African economies. But today, you can't compare Korea with Ghana. We say in 1960, Korea and Ghana were very much at par, and even Ghana had more endowed human resources as well as natural resources than Korea. But today, Korea is miles and miles apart from Ghana. So the question is, why is it that we're not transforming? And what can IDA do to enable this transformation? And now with IDA21, the key issues are going to be around the policy package. What would be the kind of policies that would drive economic transformation? And I think I can mention 2 issues that I think has to be considered. One, it has to be aligned with the countries, the either country's own plans, and development plans. It shouldn't be driven by the World Bank or the Bretton Woods, agendas. It has to be aligned with that, which means that these countries must also have robust medium-term to long-term development plans. The second issue is that it has to also at least help to drive the major areas in the SDGs that are faltering. And when we look at it, well, SDGs are improving in all the areas that I've been mentioning, but at a very slow pace. But 2 of them, malnutrition and food security, actually going south. So if IDA would concentrate in those areas also, it would help. Okay. I'll just stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ed. And I think this is a very nice point to bring in our colleagues from the bank. And perhaps I'll start off with Andrew. Ed has talked about issues around alignment with national development plans. I think the statistic is quite stark. Starting off with 81, 17 have graduated, of which none are from the African continent. I think, a bit of tongue in cheek, but is IDA just trying to keep Africa where it is so that we can keep coming here every year and having the conversation with you. But on a more serious note, of course, there is a poly-crisis that is threatening to worsen the situation of many vulnerable countries in Africa and the global south more generally. What is your take, you think, from what Ed has said, particularly whether it's not worked for the African continent? What do you think can be done differently in this negotiation round and in this replenishment to see that perhaps 1 or 2 countries may actually graduate from IDA?
Thank you. And it's good to see a lot of you here, and my good friend Ed here. We could have a long debate about, in fact, whether growth is enough or not. But let me start off by saying, look, so what will it take for IDA21 to succeed? So if you think about IDA, and I'm sure Enrique will have better information here about IDA because he sits specifically in a unit that deals with IDA. But from my perspective, working on African issues, so if you think about IDA, IDA is a really big social impact fund. It's a pooled fund that is owned by the cooperative that owns the World Bank, which is the member countries of the World Bank. And whether it succeeds or not will depend on the generosity of its contributors. Okay, so that's the first point I want to make. And then the second thing is whether, in fact, there is going to be an alignment and a shared vision about what IDA can actually achieve. Okay? So let me say 5 things about why IDA is actually really, really important. And then I'll come back to answer the question that Ed posed. Well, the first one is that IDA is actually one of the most efficient ways of delivering aid. Okay? Instead of every donor going to a country and trying to run projects, okay, IDA really takes away that fragmentation. So we talk a lot about, oh, we should really stop this aid fragmentation. Well, IDA is the mechanism and the instrument for doing that. Okay? So that's the first. Second, IDA actually been very impactful. It finances education, health, roads, water and sanitation, power plants, these very, very important core development issues that countries need. And it does so without burdening these countries with a lot of debt, because it either is in form of grants, I think Enrique will talk a lot more about that, or it only charges very, very low interest rate, no interest rates or low interest rate. So it only requires maybe some kind of a reflow at nominal values at the minimum. Okay? So you couldn't possibly find a better deal in terms of channeling capital, which is desperately needed for a lot of these poor countries, than that form of capital. Okay? You can't find a cheaper, more efficient way of delivering that capital. And the third point is that actually it finances programs that are owned by the governments. IDA doesn't go and tell the government, oh, we're going to, you have to do this. No. It actually finances things that this government strategy and government's development plans. Okay? So there is a real commitment to making sure that, that there is an alignment with government's vision, and that, in fact, the governments themselves are the ones who are in the driver's seat, who implement this. And so if you take all that and then you think, okay, what is the trajectory for African development going forward, which is this is a continent that is young, that needs to really transform its economies, expand the productive capacity of its economy, but at the same time find themselves being locked out in commercial financial markets, okay, and have high levels of debt. What's the best instrument for realizing that vision of creating, transforming this economy and getting better jobs? Then IDA actually will play an incredibly important role, right? That's not to say that IDA is the only thing that can do this. And I think that is where it's important to have a conversation with Ed, okay? You have to have governments that are serious about how they want to use IDA, okay? So institutional quality is very important. Africa has been, the reason why Africa has not reduced poverty and have not seen a lot of graduations is because Africa has been a low growth region for 60 years. At no decade has Africa grown above 3.3%, 3% per capita. No decade. And it's not only that, it would have been great if, in fact, for those 60 years, they have grown at 3% per capita. It will be a completely different continent. No, it is 3% per capita for 10 years, another 10 years of 0 per capita growth, followed by another 10 years of 3 per capita, and on and on. So it's like up and down, up and down. So you kind of, your progress is completely hindered. Having said that, Ghana of 20 years ago, is a very different country than Ghana of today. Okay? Let's just be clear. The GDP per capita in Ghana has probably doubled or more in 20 years. And that's because, first of all, they got debt relief, but then they put in place reforms and policies that that allow them to utilize these available cheap resources in order to develop. And a lot of countries in Africa have done that. There are a lot of countries in Africa that use IDA really, really well. And I don't need to name countries here, but I think if you take a look at our reports, you will be able to see the countries that are doing very well, that have moved from where they were to really, really have made enormous progress in educational attainment, in achieving parity between boys and girls in school, have built roads and improved the infrastructure and so on and so on, and almost entirely financed by IDA, and of course their own domestic resources, right? But you cannot put all the honors and the responsibility on IDA. It has to come from the government's own plans and vision and implementation capacity. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I want to bring in Fatih here because you've heard Andrew sat there next to you talk about Africa being a low-growth region for the past 60 years, and that IDA is probably one of the most progressive financial instruments or funds out there to see the continent through. But maybe from your perspective at Oxfam, do you feel like the proposed policy framework that Andrew is describing will, particularly in the context of IDA21, will change some of the very bleak picture that he has mentioned, though also promoting IDA as being a very progressive fund in that sense, and particularly maybe with the focus of dealing with issues of economic inequality, gender inequality, and public services. Do you think that there's some sort of reconciliation that you can make there with what he has just said from your perspective at Oxfam?
Well, we can reconcile to some extent. But first of all, thank you for inviting me, and also I'm sorry about my being late. I was in another panel discussing the IMF quotas and the reform.
Okay.
So for us, we think that generous and robust IDA replenishment is very important. It's something we support. We think that there's evidence that this kind of aid saves lives, and it reduces inequality to some extent. And we think this is the main challenge across the continent. But not everything is roses and bubbles. But we think also that beyond reaching a big IDA, what is needed is a better IDA. And the presidents of Ghana and Kenya and Zambia, they issued a joint op-ed, and they said that the current system needs more than adjustment. It needs an overhaul. And we find ourselves agreeing with that. We say better IDA. I think we all have a different definition of what is a better IDA. And Andrew, you did mention that a better IDA is a bigger IDA with more commitments thanks to generosity of donor countries. But for us, a better IDA is an IDA that not only minimizes the cost of finance, but most importantly, an IDA that catalyzes investment into inequality-busting sectors and initiatives. Funds like IDA, they're very important. We're here to discuss this today. They're so important because collectively, we have failed to address the extreme inequality that is within countries and between countries, and this specifically in Africa. The IMF MD mentioned that we have an obligation to correct what has been most seriously wrong over the last 100 years, the persistence of high economic inequality. And we also agree with this statement. Not only inequality is persistent, but it's also rising. Income inequality has increased in 37 countries over the past decades, including Burkina Faso, Burundi, Ethiopia, and Zambia. These are all IDA countries. These are all also countries where we as Oxfam have offices, and we do work with communities. We see firsthand the effect of the rising inequalities in these countries. So we think that between now and 2030, which is the goal for the SDGs, the timeline for SDGs, IDA has two opportunities to address this issue. It's now or 2027, but 2024 must set the stage. IDA21 must set the stage. Otherwise, inequalities will keep rising, and it's going to make the job even harder. IDA21 must set the stage by prioritizing more equitable economies through investments in, as I mentioned, inequality-busting sectors: universal protection, social protection, public services, progressive tax systems, gender equality, care infrastructure, climate adaptation, and overall broader socio-economic transformation. We think that access to quality public services such as healthcare, education, and social protection, they remain the critical issue for millions of people across the continent. And IDA has a role to play in overcoming this challenge. The framework for IDA21 must commit to building a robust, universal, right-based public system of education, health, and social protection. And here's a very concrete and simple proposal. The IDA21 should support countries to remove school and user fees to make them accessible to all while maintaining good quality education. It must reach the goals of universal health coverage and a stronger, adequate, trained healthcare workforce and more financial risk protection in healthcare. Talking specifically about the way IDA policy framework is framed, we have found the language of the bank a bit timid or weak in some areas. You know, we're the vigilante, so we'll speak our mind, right?
Indeed.
So on financial protection, the proposed strategic direction for IDA restricts social protection only to protection of the poorest, when it should be aiming for universal social protection. It also focuses on learning poverty instead of ensuring universal school completion and committing that all students be taught by a trained, professionally qualified, and motivated teacher. Only using the percentage of children unable to read by the end of primary school as the main education indicator, we think it's a real step back, even from the SDG commitment. And we should aim to provide children with 12 years of free, inclusive, quality primary and secondary education. So on another note, it's worrying that for the first time since 2010, the proposed policy framework for this cycle of IDA has deprioritized gender as a special theme or focus area, and has instead proposed that it's going to be a lens or a cross-cutting issue. But evidence has shown that this might not be the right approach. And we think that this is not how IDA will effectively address gender equality. Another proposal, the bank must quickly stress the importance of gender equality and reaffirm its commitment to ensure that all the investments under IDA recognize and effectively address the unequal in power affecting gender in an unequal manner. The risk of setbacks to gender inequality or to gender equality is very high, as women, girls are disproportionately affected by the crisis that we're going through. So the policy framework, the IDA policy framework, it's on the right path to help our continent overcome and at least reduce some of the challenges, but it must be implemented smartly and for the right concerns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatih. Enrique, I want to bring you in on some of the dimensions that both Ed, Jane, and now Fatih have introduced to the to this conversation, and within the sort of IDA21 policy package that's been discussed, and the negotiations that are taking place. Is there a sense from the bank that this negotiation, this replenishment, will stimulate productivity? It will have real impact on investments in the real economy, but more importantly, deliver programs or proposals and the required finance that are, to use Fatih's phrase here, that are inequality busting, that then can sort of help us get over this socioeconomic transformation line that many of us hope this replenishment will deliver.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you for the suggestions, but also for inviting me to speak here today. You know, we are in replenishment mode this year, and we are seeking to increase our engagement with all stakeholders, CSOs also. This is very important for us. I'm not sure if you have observed it, but we are really trying to step up our engagement with CSOs, because we do feel that it's always important to have your views, to have your support, particularly in this very difficult replenishment year. So I hope that you've observed it. If not, then we have to do even better. In terms of the policy framework, just to understand where we are, we discussed with IDA participants, which are the deputies and the borrower representatives, the strategic directions back in March, informed by a previous early discussion we had at the midterm review in Zanzibar in December. And what we have right now is relatively broad areas of work, that cover what we feel and what the IDA participants feel are address key development challenges of IDA countries. And the buckets, as you may have seen, are people, prosperity, planet, infrastructure, digital, and then we have 4 lenses. One of them is gender, then we also have private investment, jobs, and fragility. I would argue that a lot of the priorities will be defined over the next 6 months, Within these big buckets, that I just mentioned, there's going to be policy commitments, there's going to be results, and there's going to be priorities identified for all IDA countries. So over the next 6 months, we're going to have to work together, to ensure that a lot of what you're raising is reflected in the policy package. But just to say that based on what I'm hearing today, I think a lot of it will be reflected in the policy package. For example, on food security and malnutrition, this is one of the areas that we are contemplating within Planet. There is a big focus on increasing productivity under jobs. We do also look at equality in the access to services. So that, I mean, it may not be perfect, or it may not be exactly what you're looking for, but what you are raising today as priorities does resonate quite a bit with the discussions I've been having. I mean, let me also mention here that what we will be negotiating is both the policy framework, that is important, but also the financing framework. And there, let me explain a little bit how IDA works, As you know, we have financing from several sources, and then we allocate the resources to countries based on both income as well as the risk of debt distress and the size of the country. We have an exception for small states. That means we give particularly cheap financing to small states. That financing framework is also important because it goes to the heart of some of the things that we are discussing here today. What is happening with debt, in many IDA countries? I think 54% or 56% of IDA countries today are at high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress. If you look at the financing flows to these countries over the next 2-3 years, or the last 2-3 years, multilaterals, in particular IDA, is the main financing source for these countries. So our ability to continue providing financing flows to countries at high risk of debt distress or in debt distress is very important, and it's part of the financing framework that we will be discussing. We have the Sustainable Development Finance Policy, where we incentivize countries to address the drivers of debt vulnerabilities. We've been implementing it for 4 years now. It was a big change with how the bank operates. I think at the beginning there was quite a bit of nervousness around this policy. By now, when you talk to many clients and to many of our teams, they do appreciate the incentives that the policy is putting in place for improved debt management, debt transparency, fiscal sustainability. Let me just say one more thing. I think it's super important that you remain very engaged over the next 6 months. We will have many touch points with CSOs. This year, we're going to have also regional engagements with CSOs to discuss the policy framework, how what is being discussed, what is being agreed, and we will have them at the regional level. So we will go to Africa East, to Africa West, and organize regional engagements to be closer to local CSOs, because we have recognized that that may be a weakness of previous replenishments. We are going to also have at each touch point or at each meeting that we have with the IDA participants, we will have an IDA forum with CSOs. At the same time, we had it, I think we had it on Wednesday, if I remember correctly, while we are only meeting deputies on Sunday. So this time we actually met CSOs before we met with the deputies. And we will continue to do that over the rest of the replenishment. We have IDA Africa Heads of Summit, Heads of State Summit on the 29th of April. President Ruto is organizing this. And the way that we have discussed it is, for us, is very important that the voice of Africa is heard loud and clear, both in terms of the priorities for IDA21, as well as the financing that you would need for the continent. So this is just an invitation to make sure that you remain very engaged with us, that you are vigilantes, and we welcome that, and that you keep us honest, and that you continue to engage with us. That's very important. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Enrique. I'm also very cognizant of time, but I do want to take a second round with the panel before I open it up to the rest of us to share your thoughts, questions, and comments. I'll start in the same order. Jane, I want to come to you because there's something that Enrique has mentioned in terms of the policy package that's being discussed and the different buckets. And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on the private sector one, because, you know, many concerns from particularly civil society from Africa has been this, and you know, developing regions at large, is this continuation or perpetuation of heavy involvement of private sector and facilitating private sector, particularly on the finance side, when it comes to accessing development finance. How does that make you feel when you hear private sector being part of a very, what is supposed to be, as Andrew put it, a very accessible and very efficient pot of money or fund, but and it's supposed to be accessible to countries that need it the most. But there's a role that's being given to the private sector in this replenishment and negotiation. How do you think we need to address that and approach that part in particular? And if I can just ask you to be a bit brief so that we can do the full round and then open. Thank you.
Thank you so much. IDA has a private sector window. And for me, I think this is a risk of diverting this concessional funding to the private sector. But we also need to remember that the bank has been pushing the private sector. In fact, when you look at maybe the bank loves the private sector more than even our governments. And I just want to go back to the issue, Andrew, which you have raised, that Africa is a low-growth region. And I wanted to say the bank has a big part to play in that because African countries have faithfully followed the advice you have given as a bank. The structured adjustment programs, we privatized, we liberalized. In fact, we liberalized our financial and economical and financially, we liberalized. We deregulated. Even today, our civil service is very low and government is nowhere to be seen. And this is how it has been. Even today, going back to the issue which you have raised on the private sector, the financialization of our economy, the real economy is being financialized to even climate change, even food, agriculture, financialized to make it attractive to private sector investment. You look at the land. I give you an example in Uganda, land which was communally owned. World Bank brought a project to give individual land certificates. Today, the whole area it's a problem. People are buying land, especially the women are off land. So for me, in fact, if we are to look at IDA to work, we need to look at the broader context within which IDA is working. IDA itself has to change because IDA, in any case, they are just projects. But we need to look at it broadly. Look at the broad World Bank policies, which you push on our countries, but also look at the broader global context, because we need to restructure, to reform the international financial architecture, but also the multilateral trading system. So when we sit here and we say IDA is going to work, I agree IDA will have used it in my country to do infrastructure, but it's like we're on a drip. If you remove it, and in fact in my country you have removed it, you have reduced it by 80%. And the moment you reduce it, we can't sustain it, because one of the projects was social protection in a certain vulnerable region. You have reduced it for a number of reasons, which we can't go in here, by 80%. And we can't sustain that. In fact, our country is begging, please come back. But that isn't what we need. We need to sustain, we need to get off that drip. We need to break the cycle of poverty, the cycle of debt.
Thank you very much, Jane. And I want to just pick up on that, Ed, just to bring you in. I mean, part of this is the technical work in understanding how the financing or the replenishment is going to work and where it's going to be invested and directed. But a bigger part of this conversation is the political conversation that will be taken by leaders of governments, heads of state, and then followed through by officials from ministries of finance. Now, Enrique touched, and this was already on my pre-prepared list of questions, but there is a summit in Nairobi that is taking place, being hosted by the President of Kenya, His Excellency Ruto. And in that summit, I mean, from a political point of view, if we want this replenishment to be a replenishment of all replenishments, a replenishment that really, jumpstarts the African continent in particular, but developing countries more generally speaking. What is the political calculation or analysis that we need to be considering to make sure that this is the replenishment of all replenishments? As Fatih said, we've only got one more before 2030 for the SDGs.
Yeah, I think that, first of all, the meeting in Nairobi is going to be critical. As you already know, they formed the African Club, basically looking at all these dimensions and seeing how it can work. But I just wanted to emphasize two things. For us to converge, for me to converge with Andrew
on growth.
On growth, is that for IDA21 to really be really different from the previous IDAs, I think there are 2 or 3 key areas that we need to look at. Enrique had mentioned of the fact that you're consulting with civil society and so on. But in my view, that is very perfunctory. It doesn't lead anywhere. In fact, in the PRGF, as part of the requirements is that the government must have citizens' consultation. But when you look at what the citizen consultation is, it's really perfunctory.
Yes.
They invite them, they talk to them, and then people raise questions, and that's it. That's not what we're talking about. So for IDA21 to work well, there must be some built-in into the policy framework how you design and implement projects, which would include CSOs and other actors, to ensure accountability, monitoring, and so on. Because there's always a big gap between the political hierarchy and the rest of the citizens. Once the governments, they win power, then they go on their own way. They're no longer accountable to the people. So that's one thing. And then the other point that Enrique mentioned is talking about going regional and having this conversation. But I think there's a much broader issue, is that can IDA be used to help to further the regional integration in Africa? In other words, we're looking at a situation where you have small countries that, for all intents and purposes, can never transform unless they integrate with the others. Okay. And I think that drive either can be a catalyst to ensure that many of the national problems that have actually regional solutions can be addressed through that process. In that case, you'll be addressing a real public good issue. So those are the 2 things I just wanted to mention. On the political side, I think that there is a convergence emerging. Last year we were not where we were today. Now you can see that the African leaders are beginning to talk with one voice, and they're addressing these issues of the global financial architecture and how to move it forward. And having the African voice in that conversation, I think is important.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ed. Fatih, if I can just bring you in very briefly as well before we open it up. Just on this same issue of the private sector investment, because you've talked about your sentiments of the marginalization or actually the exclusion of gender as a main issue, and it being just considered as a cross-cutting dimension. But also what Jane talked about, when you include private sector, sometimes there are these other costs that deepen inequality. What is the kind of direction of travel you feel that, like from Oxfam's perspective, they would need to do together with other civil society actors to ensure that the involvement or increasing involvement of private sector in this IDA conversation does not lead to this marginalization and deepening inequality, particularly with the privatization of things like health, education, and so on?
Well, thank you, Jason. You did mention that you're going to open the floor. I hope you're going to give our friends from the World Bank an opportunity to respond, because I'm also about to put them on the hot seat.
Please do. Please do, and they will start responding.
So adding to what Jane has said, we are not very excited about the private sector window. we don't want to fall into the mirage of private investments. Private sector has proven that it's very good at taking care of itself. IFC, MIGA, they are profit-generating institutions. We feel that they don't need IDA's money. They can take care of themselves. The ones that cannot take care of themselves is the vulnerable people. And we have never seen private sector putting people first. So private sector can, if left unchecked, exacerbate inequalities. So this is where our concern is. And the PSW, we've been told it has sent more than $5 billion US dollars to IFC. And despite this funding, PSW has produced mixed results so far. So we're also asking about sustainability or impact of this money being diverted from 0% loans and low-interest loans to this institution. We know there's funding constraints. We all hope for a big IDA, but we don't know how much it's going to be. But whatever the size of the cake, it's not going to be enough. We know that there's many competing priorities. So there's a trade-off in sending money to this PSW. Should we send money to IFC to support the liquidity of a client, or should we prioritize to finance social safety nets and prevent some of the social safety net systems to collapse? It's good that we're looking at supporting the private sector, but we cannot achieve economic transformation if we don't have public investment into healthcare, into education, and into social protection. So we would invite the bank to look at PSW and ask themselves hard questions about the purpose of IDA and if it's matching what's happening when we're sending money to this window. We think that IFC should be transferring resources back into IDA. Why not? And this could help the historical reversal and the development gains that we're looking for. And I will end just with another proposals. Let's close the private sector window for IDA21, and let's redirect the funding towards pressing priorities such as expanding the crisis response window or investing in long-term strengthening of healthcare, education, or social protection services. We need really this exercise to happen, and we need the political will to address issues that are systemic and necessary for the transformation, economic transformation.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Fatih. Andrew, Enrique, I will come to you. I just want to, I hope you've taken note of all these vigilantes that are after you. But I want to open it up now to, I'm not aware if there's anyone online, so you'll excuse me. I hope maybe one of these screens may show questions or people. But there is a microphone right over here. If you could please just come forward, introduce yourself, and present your question. So we've started on this side. So Louise, Joab, and yeah, please, in that order.
Thank you very much. My name is Luis Vieira with the Bretton Woods Project. We're actually one of the proud co-sponsors of what I think has been a very good panel, so thank you very much. Unsurprisingly, I suppose, Andrew, question to you. As our sister Jane was speaking about the long-term impacts of World Bank programming in Africa in particular, you seemed not necessarily to agree with her. So being less polemic, I guess, you have the facts on the ground. You haven't had economic transformation in Africa, and that's where I want to focus on, economic transformation. That hasn't happened. You look at the data presented by the panelists, right? It's undisputable that that has not happened. We recognize that the World Bank is not solely responsible for that. So, retrospectively, as a chief economist, what do you think the bank needs to do differently in terms of policy support to those countries, right? And I think this links into another question that was raised around the CSO engagement. And we note that the bank has, with the Evolution Roadmap, has highlighted this knowledge compact and this focus on including other points of view and other inputs. But what I haven't heard about is the details of how precisely this will be integrated in country programming. And, will the bank go beyond its usual approach of engagement and really ensure that other academics from the continent and other continents are involved in the deliberations, etc. So I'd really like to hear your diagnostic. What has gone wrong in the World Bank's approach in the past, and what must it do looking forward? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Luis. Joab, and then...
Thank you so much. My name is Joab Okanda. I'm with Christian Aid. Just picking up from where Jen left, I think we've faithfully followed the policy advice of the World Bank, and this tells us maybe two things: that by design, those policies are supposed to keep us the way we are, or I don't want to use this term, or we are so stupid enough as Africans to continue faithfully following the policy advice of the World Bank. There was a discussion at the beginning, especially by Jen and my brother from ASET, about the issue of the industrial policy and whether this should be the core of the policy package that you're developing, and how that industrial policy should look like in the context of in the current context where we're seeing rich countries in the guise of climate action coming up with initiatives that are actually, in the real sense, they are trade weapons. They're inflation management tools for their own national economies. Initiatives or actions such as the IRA in the US, the Inflation Regulatory Act, CBAM that the EU has come up with, and the UK is already talking about it, whether this should form part of the policy package and part of the conversations that you're going to discuss. Thank you.
Thanks, Joab. Please.
My name is Samah Sanmana. I'm from Sudan, and thank you for a very rich discussion. My perspective, I just want to maybe add some thoughts and hear your feedback. Well, right now Sudan is at war, but before it was looking at HIPC and debt forgiveness and a lot of investment into various sectors. So, for example, there's a huge potential in the renewable energy sector, solar, wind, and there was quite a pipeline of projects there. I think one of the things from a policy perspective that I haven't heard much talk about is capacity building in terms from institutional capacity. Because what we see is the projects are there, but what happens is that the regulatory frameworks are not there. So the PPP frameworks, the PPA, the IPP, the how do you get the energy back, feed-in tariff to the national grid? How do you electrify so that you can reach the marginalized, the poor, the rural areas, and electrify the country? So that's one is the institutional capacity. The second, and this is really Jane's point, I was struck by her point. She was talking about value addition and beneficiation of commodities. I'll give you an example. For Sudan, we have groundnuts. We have gum arabic. Gum arabic is 80% produced in Sudan. There have been various attempts to beneficiate and do that industrialization in country. The problem, again, is infrastructure. So in order to, 70% of the workers in the forestry industry, gum arabic, are women. They would be the major beneficiaries of beneficiation and value addition and sharing of that profit pool. But the major industry is in France and in Germany. How do you bring some of that industry to Sudan? Well, the major obstacles, as if you want to export, you need stable power supplies, you need effluent waste systems, you need all of these things. So it's infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. So these are the 2 points, and I would love to hear your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we have one more. Please.
Hello, thank you so much for your panel. It was really interesting. My name is Zahir. I'm from the Youth Policy Forum in Bangladesh and a student over at Columbia. We work back home on economic diversification and value addition. And it's really refreshing to hear that the IDA also works on that sort of aspect of industrialization. But the issue that we've noticed is in Bangladesh, the obstacle is a collective action problem. You have the government, you have the private sector, you have the CSO, but no one wants to move first when it comes to reforms. No one wants to move first in this process of industrial policy. I mean, we have such a big garments industry, but why is that industry not moving up the value chain? There's no incentive to move up that value chain. And I've heard a lot about the IDA21. I must admit, this was also the first time I've heard of the IDA21. I'm very young. But but what I have appreciated is, yes, there's consultation of CSOs. You're speaking to us right now. There's consultation with the private sector. But what happens during this period? Are we still in contact with the private sector? Are we still in contact with the government? Are they speaking to each other, which I think is the biggest gap? Will they continue to speak to us after our intervention? What provisions do we actually make for this in the IDA21? And or even if we aren't, why aren't we? Is there a limitation in the World Bank's mandate for this? And the final request is a personal one. If the IDA21 wants to fund me, I am more than happy to. But thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Zahir, and refreshing as well to hear that. Some serious questions here, Andrew and Enrique, but I do also want to give the opportunity to Fatih, Ed, and Jane to also come in at some point when on some of the things. But I don't know. I deliberately didn't bring you in on the second round of conversation because I wanted to hear from the audience as well. But I don't know who wants to go first, Andrew or Enrique to.
All right.
Okay, Andrew, go on.
Yeah. That's fine. That's fine. Okay, very, very important questions. I'm not sure that I have the answers to all of them, but let me take some. What has gone wrong? Okay, so that's the question. I think that it's really important for all of us to remind ourselves that development is basically a risk-taking action. Okay, you have to take a risk. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. It's a very complex story, right? You have to bring in all kinds of things together. You have to bring in a coalition of people who really willing are invested in this endeavor. You have to mobilize resources, okay? You have to agree on a plan, right? And then you have to try and execute by either, if you have the capacity, and if you don't, at least to hire capacity or to buy one, okay? And even if you do all that, it might not work. Okay, so we should not think that somehow development outcomes are given if you just did A, B, C, D.
Sorry, Jason,
okay?
Maybe I wasn't very clear. Can I make it clear? I was speaking specifically about the bank.
I'm coming to that. Okay, so that's the first thing that is important to remember. Second, what has the bank done? So if you really look at the history of African development, okay, the economic history of Africa, there was a time, I remember, when people were on the streets all the time, 1980s. A lot of you are very young. You don't remember that, okay? Inflation was rampant. Fiscal deficits were out of control. Anybody who came out of a graduate school was hired by the government, but then they can't pay them, so they inflated the economy, right? Hunger was rampant. So when you talk about, the World Bank gave them advice that, well, actually the World Bank said, look, the first thing you need to do is to bring your macroeconomic stability. Bring inflation under control, okay? Pay your farmers more and don't tax them so that they don't go to the farms and produce, right? And instead of paying 1,000 groundnut factory workers a premium and basically impoverishing 100,000 groundnut farmers, right? You need to open up the market so that these groundnut farmers can actually make money on their farms. That's the liberalization, right? So when you look at what actually the World Bank advised, it's precisely the recovery. I know it's very controversial and nobody actually wants to face this fact, but it is actually the truth that because of what World Bank and IMF advise these countries to do, which is to start with sequential things to, stabilizing your economy, opening up the markets so that at least your farmers, your entrepreneurs can actually take advantage of the signals and incentives, is what led to the recovery that we enjoyed throughout the 2000s. That is incontrovertible. Okay? So I'm going to say that, and I'm going to actually defend it. So when you say, so that's one thing. So right now we are in the middle of a crisis. Okay? One of the biggest crises was a shock that happened outside of Africa, a war happening far away that led to inflation. A lot of inflation in Africa. Would you rather that the African countries didn't control inflation? Because that's one advice the World Bank gives to the countries. You need to bring inflation under control so that, and by the way, guess what happened? The recovery that we're predicting in our recent Africa Pulse is led primarily by the recovery of private consumption. Because households now have this feeling that inflation has come under control, that they feel confident that in fact they can go out and spend on products. And that is the signal that entrepreneurs need in order to invest. So here is what I am saying about what went wrong. What went wrong is there are things that you have to do. There are 10 things you have to do in terms of policy moves. And if you do 8 of those correct, you might actually have an inflection in your growth. But if you do only 4 correct and the other 6 you don't, you might not. You end up probably in the kind of land that Africans find themselves, So that would be what I would say went wrong, okay? There are some things that Africans have done, reforms that they have done that have stabilized the economy, that have grounded. But then you need other things in order to be able to move to a higher level of growth, an inflection point. One of those things is not taking investments in sectors really seriously, especially sectors like agriculture. That's one big failure in Africa, okay? And it is still the failure that underlies a lot of the underperformance of the growth. And why is that? It's because we haven't taken seriously the issues around water management for agriculture. We're too reliant on rain. And with the climate change, the variability is even worse than it has been in the past, okay? Second, there's a lot of policy failure still. And there's just so much World Bank advice can do. You have to own these policies as a government. Okay? So that is the key. The key thing is there are specific policy failures, there are specific investment failures that the governments haven't done in key sectors that are necessary. Before you come to industrial policy, no, for goodness sake, do the 8 top things before you come to industrial policy. I'm not opposed to industrial policy. But do the top 8 things first. Then, if you do industrial policy, maybe you are on a different trajectory. But you could get a lot. You can get far by just doing. I know Ed is dying to come in, but okay. So I agree that things like CBAM are going to harm African trade. Okay, the carbon, in case people don't know what that is, it is carbon border adjustment, whatever, price. Yeah, carbon, yeah, exactly. Those kinds of things are going to hurt African trade. And I think, I don't know what the African countries should do, but I think it's one of those things where maybe they need collective action, okay? They need to coordinate their actions and their lobbying and their position with their European trading partners, right? In order to avoid a bit of a trade war. Now, if you are a small African economies and you're going to try and fight a really juggernaut like EU, you're probably not going to win, okay? But if you coordinate your actions and do collective action, maybe you can gain some concessions. Okay, so that's the kind of, and same thing with the issues around IRA. Now, one thing about all this is that IRA actually has a very big component in terms of either research or also resources for these new technologies. Now, a lot of those African countries have. So you could probably make a case. You could lobby to have a lot of those investments be made in Africa. But all that requires coordination and collective action, some kind of a regional coordination of some sort. Am I out of time?
Very quickly.
I was going to say something about the private sector. Look, I don't know about the private sector window, so that I'll leave to Henrique. But there is absolutely no way African countries can grow and have the kind of the quality of growth, which my friend here, I'm completely in agreement. The quality of growth matters, right? Without a really deep, robust private sector. You cannot have it. Okay, let's just have that as a fact. You will not have that growth that you desire without really, really robust, deep, diversified, competitive private sector. The way to do that?
Not IDA. Not IDA money. This is our point.
Okay, IDA money or not IDA money? You need private sector because of, because Jen was completely against the private sector, right? Okay, clarify.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I know that all of a sudden the clock started running faster than us. But Enrique, there were some comments and questions here around capacity at the institutional level. The example that Samara gave on Sudan, issues around value addition. And I guess this is the segue to this issue, this idea of the private sector window. And maybe perhaps I can dovetail on that. When we talk about private sector here, is it worth distinguishing between foreign multinational corporation private sector and sort of domestic private sector?
No.
In the context of the IDA.
Well, maybe in the context of IDA, I don't.
I want to put it in that way because this is also what the session is contending, that there is this issue with the PSW, and perhaps maybe you could clarify a little bit more on that.
Okay, so thanks so much. On private investment and whether we need it or not, I think private sector. I won't go into that. But there was a question of whether we loved more the private sector than the government, and we love everybody. but just to give you a sense, of the replenishment, 93 billion, we gave, I think, 2.5 billion for the private sector window. So it's less than 3%, if my math is right, between 3 and 4%. So we love the private sector 3 or 4%. We love the public sector 96% or 97%. So gives you a sense of where we are. I think have a look at for December, for the MTR, we had a report where we look at the impact that the private sector window has had. There are two reports, one from us, from IDA, and you can say, those guys are not objective. They are all telling us stories. There is one by the Impact IEG, Have a look at that one, Because when they started doing it, we were actually a little bit worried. It's like, let's see what they find, And it is a very, very positive, candid evaluation of what the private sector window is achieving and what it is not achieving, And I think what it does is de-risk investments that it would otherwise not happen. And it's difficult to what is the counterfactual? It's not easy, But let me tell you something else that for me was music to my ears, Because I do sit and I do approve these investments, and each time it's like, I also think of the trade-offs, Should we be doing this or should we be doing something else? I was in Sweden talking to for some meetings, and we organized a meeting with the Stockholm Institute of Energy, I think they are called. And they started telling me they are looking at de-risking instruments for renewable energies. And they started talking about a fantastic project they have found, huge impact, they assume. And they told me this would not have happened without the PSW. It's mobile energy generation, solar, in Chad. I mean, you said the private sector takes good care of itself. It does. And that's why they don't go into Chad to invest in energy generation. They don't. So if you want the private sector to go and invest in energy generation, we are going to have to help a little bit. And that's what the private sector window does. It's difficult, and we are always looking at, are we minimizing concessionality, are we maximizing impact, and we are very aware of the trade-offs, But I do think that it has an impact, that we are not going to get to the growth and to the jobs that we want through public sector only. I think public sector investments in infrastructure, in skills, in places that the private sector won't go is crucial. But I think de-risking private sector investment with 3 or 4% of IDA is a value proposition that we need to consider very seriously. Have a look at the IG report, and have a look at some other independent assessments of what the PSW is doing. Don't take my word for it, but look at other assessments. We do have the regional window that supports regional integration in Africa, and there is quite a bit of demand for it. So I think we are supporting regional integration. Private sector, whether we talk to the private sector or the governments, so we don't necessarily do that through a centralized organization, through the replenishment. But I've been mostly based abroad, working in country programs in Pakistan, in Mozambique, in Indonesia, and there we were always, helping and facilitating the engagement within the private sector and the government where it made sense. And in some areas, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and then we were not doing that. Let me stop here.
All right, thank you very much. We've got about 5 minutes left. I've seen one hand, 2 hands, and no hands there. Okay, so you've had yours already. We're running out of time, Joab. I'm sorry. But I have the lady first, and then Nathan behind you.
Who wants to come?
But I just ask, be very precise, just in the interest of time, please.
I'm Marilena Castro, Social Development Specialist. I'm Mexican. And I just want to make the point that when we're talking about private sector, we might be talking about Elon Musk and the small enterprise in Mexico. In Mexico, 85% of the small and medium enterprises provide the jobs. So just take into account that private sector is not everybody. Focus and provide some assistance to these small and medium enterprises.
Thank you.
Okay, this will be hard, but just quick on the private sector window. I think to the points you're making about the project in Chad, for example, and how much Sweden likes the private sector window, well, at a minimum, those profits and proceeds should be shared and redistributed back into IDA, right? So transferring funds from IFC, which is making profits and has good net income gains in the last few years, is exposed to better interest rates, which actually hurts IDA now in terms of raising money in capital markets. So there should be a really hard look taken at the PSW and the fact that there's a lot of money just sitting in it that's not getting used. So that's where the mixed results come from. There should, at a minimum, I think it'd be mind-boggling to give more money to PSW now when there's over $4 billion sitting there from the last 2 replenishments. So, and also, what's the role of the guarantees and the one-stop shop guarantees in helping facilitate these investments as well? And then lastly, a quick process question. For all of us trying to follow and engage in this and understand where the meaningful points of engagement and influence and opportunities are, my question is okay, we have this proposed framework. You have 5 focus areas from the bank. They restructured the whole thing and put their own priorities on the table. Donors have kind of accepted this as the new state of play.
but we are in a year of negotiation. So I'm really frustrated that everywhere I turn, this is like the accepted state of play. Like there's been no discussion. Not to say that these areas are bad, but we have some concerns with maybe the narrative that is driving, and also there's no room for, let's say, borrower countries to really find space for their own priorities because it's already on the table. So if on April 29th, let's say a number of heads of state, I'm not saying what will happen, I can't predict that, but like let's say that they say, actually, we think this framework is missing something. It's missing a focus area. What will the bank do? What will Banga do? What will the deputies, how will they respond to that? Is there room to actually change that? So.
All right. Thank you very much for that. We've got about 3 minutes left. So what?
No, it's over there.
I think what I will request our speakers to do is, as you try and respond, to also give us your sort of golden nuggets to go away with about how we can actually make IDA21 the replenishment of all replenishment. So maybe I'll start on that end and I'll work our way this way. So I'll start with Fatih, Andrew, Ed, Enrique, Jane, but very briefly so that we can finish on time. It is Friday after all.
Yes, yes. Mine will be very, very short. I think these spaces are valuable. We value this conversation. Let's keep this channel open. Let's continue engaging together. We don't think it's all bad, but it does need some second look, and we hope that we continue providing some of the suggestions and that you keep on listening. I say that the bank listens, but takes into consideration 10% of what we're saying. So please increase a little bit this number and keep on the channel open. Thank you.
Okay, quickly. Africa is going to be a major population center in the world. It's the one region that is growing in terms of population. It's going to provide future global workforce. Its creativity, its energy, and so on will come from there. It's really, really important to invest in the transformation of that continent. Okay? And obviously, a lot of that is going to come locally through the institutions they'll come up with, through the revenues that they will generate domestically, but IDA can play an important role in that transformation. So let me just stop there.
I think, for me, what would make IDA21 different, it's not just only the policy package itself, but it's in the design and implementation of the programs and the extent to which other key stakeholders are factored into it more formally as opposed to this perfunctory approach. Because we talk about the government, assuming that the government represents the people. But in most African countries, it doesn't. So we need to see how we can bring into that conversation and the framework some level of accountability, giving agency to the stakeholders beyond the government. I think that's important.
Thank you.
Thank you. In terms of the, so I think there was a question, if I may answer that, also on the policy framework where it was completely closed so that there would be an option to open it. So just to say that the borrowers are represented, yeah, in the fora. So the policy framework that we have right now does also represent the views of the borrowers. Of course, if on the 29th of April we hear, no, absolutely not, we need X in the policy framework, I'm pretty sure that the World Bank will listen. Yeah. But I think what we have is what has been agreed. But if there is a different agreement emerging from such a forum, I'm pretty certain we would listen. To me, I really value these discussions. I learn a lot. Yeah. I hope that we also share how the process is working and how we are open, not to 10%, but to at least 50% of what you say, at least. But to me, IDA21 will also be different through a much bigger engagement with every stakeholder. Yeah, not only CSOs, we are also talking to foundations a lot, something that we haven't done in the past. Yeah, we want to talk also to local CSOs. So we are really trying to open the process quite a bit because we think that this is a very different replenishment than what we've done in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane.
Thank you so much for all the comments. There was a question from Andrew that I don't like the private sector. Can I answer that briefly?
You may have to do it privately because we're out of time.
Okay.
They might
Okay,
start
then.
shooting eyes
Okay.
at me.
Okay, so let me make my concluding remarks regarding IDA. I think IDA, to make it work, there is a lot of rethink and listening that the bank has to do. But again, broadly, the World Bank also has to rethink its policies and its development model. And again, as a bank and as IFIs, and other international institutions like the WTO, I think you need to work together to be able to reform the international financial architecture, but also the multilateral trading system, because this is the broader context within which IDA is going to be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Please, let's give our panelists a round of applause. I didn't realize 90 minutes could go that quickly. So I'm sure there'll be further discussions, but allow me to thank Eurodad, actually, who set up this session, and together with Oxfam and the Bretton Woods Project, SEATINI and Asset, it's been great to moderate and a really interesting conversation, and I hope we can continue increasing the 10% to 50%. Thank you very much, and have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thank you for that moderation.